Hey everyone, welcome to a new episode of the Whiskering Podcast. Today I'm thrilled to be going back to Kentucky and we're going to visit a brand that I got introduced to and now am somewhat obsessed with, and that is Glens Creek Distilling. And we've got founder and what do you consider head distiller, master distiller,
Head
all the
distiller.
head distiller, David Meier on with us to talk. So David, welcome.
Thank you, Dave.
Do you prefer David or Dave? I've heard both.
Either one. Like I said, my mother called me Dave, but my birth certificate says David.
Fair enough. Fair enough. So, for those folks who don't know about Glens Creek quite yet, I hope that's going to change by the end of this episode. But let's start out with where you guys are.
Well, we are technically in Woodford County. We're just about 4 miles down the road from Woodford Reserve and about a mile and a half from Castle and Key. So just down the road a bit. And but our address is Frankfort. So that kind of is confusing. But we're in the Woodford County side, just down on McCracken Pike.
It's a beautiful drive to get down to you guys. You said go through Castle and Key to get there. And to me, that seems fitting. I know usually there's two roads to get in there, but one's out because of flooding.
That's right. Yeah, the road got washed out back in March 2020 or 21. I mean, sorry. And so if you GPS to get here, most likely it'll take you to the road closure. So just tell people to try to come down Duncan Road. That's the best way to get here. Or if you're at Woodford, just keep coming straight up the road.
Fair enough. And when I was driving down there, I didn't quite realize how close you were to Castle and Key, but it's a fitting kind of entry point if you go down that way. So you drive through, you see, of course, the castle, the stone buildings and all of that, the bourbon archaeology. And then you come over to Glens Creek. You pass the Old Crow distilling part of the Old Crow site with the sign still there. And then you go just a bit farther. And there on the left-hand side is Glens Creek. So I'd love to just go over the story of how you got to that site and particularly how you were able to get it away from Beam's hands.
Well, I didn't get it from Beam's hands. So the two distilleries, Old Taylor and Old Crow, were both part of Colonel H. Taylor's legacy. And so the two distilleries actually properties actually join up, and there's a lot of crossover between the two. They were both purchased by national distillers after Prohibition, and National did a major renovation here in 1935. And the history is the distillery was built in the 1870s, so that was about 20 years prior to Bottled and Bond Act of 1897, which was significant, and also before Prohibition, and also before electrification. So when Prohibition came along, and of course that put a big hurt on the industry overall. And then after Prohibition, the issue was the equipment here would have been 50 years old already. In 1935, the facility was 50 years old. And so, and just like in today's world, 50 years of technology is like a lifetime difference. So National had to do a significant renovation, and so that was in 1935. And then in 1964 they did another minor renovation, increasing capacity. And then, of course, in the 70s, the decline of bourbon started, and by the mid 80s, it was just over. And what I try to explain to people when they come here is that this distillery was built specifically for the new invention, the continuous column still, and that was first used in Europe in the early 1800s, and it was adopted in the United States in the second half of the 1800s. So these two distilleries, Old Taylor and Old Crow, were vastly larger than the previous distillery that was here. The prior to the continuous column still, most distilleries would be about the size that we are, making a few barrels a week kind of thing. And so the column still really drastically transformed this industry, and these giant facilities like what we have here came into being in the second part of the 1800s. And so, the trouble with the column still is it never stops. And once you turn it off, it's really difficult to, not the still, it's not the still, it's the boilers. I should clarify that. So the boilers that are still here in the distillery were part of that 1935 renovation. And the trouble with the old school boilers is that, they're on and they stay on. And once you heat up those bricks, if you turn it off and cool the brick down, they break. And then you have to do some extensive repairs. So they only shut the distillery down once per year during the summer months for maintenance and so forth. And so again, by the time the 80s came along, you had this convergence of a decline in sales and 50-year-old technology again. And so, there was a drastic consolidation in the industry at that time. A lot of distilleries closed as the brands consolidated and so forth. And Jim Beam bought Old Taylor and Old Crow in 1987. And this distillery closed in 1985. And, the barrels that were in the warehouse, the issue finally became that you run out of warehouse storage space. And in normal times, you can send your distillate off to some other brand, to balance out your supply and demand challenges. But when everybody's sales are down, there's really nowhere for that excess to go. And so there was massive closures all across the state in the 80s. And so Beam bought it, and what you saw down there, the sign that says Old Crow Distillery, there's no distillery over there. The distillery's on this property, but that's the entrance. That was the entrance to the facility where employees would come in to go to work. And the DSP, or distilled spirits permit, transfers with the property. So Jim Beam gets to keep the DSP number, even though there's no distillery over there. They're just storing barrels over there at this time.
Gotcha. So when you purchased the property, was it just through a regular realty?
Yeah. So the real story is a friend of mine mentioned that there was a cool old distillery for sale, and the distilling business was never anything that I intended to do. It was never in my dreams. It wasn't been a lifelong passion. When I was 50, I probably had tried 5 bourbons in my life. I wasn't much of a drinker at all. And so, but it's possible that I was doing some distilling elsewhere, undisclosed location. And so my friends knew that, and it was just kind of a hobby for me. And so he says, I had this cool distillery for sale, and it was Old Taylor. And we looked it up online, and you just look at the place and you see the history, and I'm just really fascinated by it. I like cool old things, and I like to look at how people made things, back then, and the craftsmanship, and it just fascinating. And so I drove out to Old Taylor and started looking at it. And frankly, the listing price was much higher than I could afford. And I just kept thinking, well, that they've had this thing on the market for a while, and it's from the time Beam owned it until then, it changed hands several times. And there were salvage people who owned it just prior to that. And they were, dismantling buildings and getting scrap and taking out some of the historic materials. And so anyway, I looked around the place. I mean, it's an absolute disaster. 30 years of Mother Nature just having her way. And also the issue with Castle and Key, the property sits right there on the road, and there's really no fence or security. So the local kids would hang out there and party there and vandalize the property. And so you had all of that, plus Mother Nature, plus the salvage people who they had no intention of preserving the property. So whatever they didn't want, they just throw off in some pile somewhere. So there was crap, everywhere, brick and stone, and just a mess, just an absolute mess. And, but, I really thought that it would be nice to buy that place and fix it back up. And so I devised a plan. I was going to throw this, kind of a low ball offer that I could afford out. And as I got ready to make the offer, the realtor told me that they just turned down an offer that was about twice as much as what I was going to offer. So all my dreams were crushed at that time. And then he said, well, there's another distillery just down the road that's for sale. And I thought, well, why are you just telling me this now? I mean, I spent 2 weeks sort of researching Old Taylor and looking at the property, making sure I wasn't going to buy a super fun site, that needed billions of dollars to clean up and toxic waste or any of that kind of stuff. And so when I came down here, I learned that his listing of this property had gone on. The listing had expired, so he wasn't going to get a commission. And so I just told him, I said, look, if this sale goes through, I'll make sure those guys pay you the commission because, you deserve it. You earned it. And so I started to explore this property, and this is quite a bit smaller. The reason Old Taylor was so much more expensive is 75 acres versus down here, 16 acres. So anyway, that deal went through. Things you learn along the way, like you go to a bank and you're trying to get a loan, and I've bought property in the past. I've owned homes, I've owned rental property, and so forth. And you go to a bank and you show them what you're trying to do, and if you qualify for the loan, you get a loan. But when you're trying to start a distillery and you have a business plan, and they're looking at your numbers and they say, okay, where on this timeline are you going to turn a profit? And you say, well, whiskey has to age, and so it's going to be a few years, and I anticipate going to be out here somewhere. And of course, their question is, well, what are you going to do for revenue in the meantime? And so anyway, I don't know. I probably got turned down by 12 banks or so before I finally found one that would agree to give me a loan for the place. And so then, other things you learn too, the insurance people, they come out, the buildings are in really rough shape. Some of them, the old distillery and some of the buildings are in pretty rough shape. And, how are they supposed to insure these places? And I said, look, I don't need insurance on all of this. I just need insurance on this place where we're going to operate the business. And so anyway, it was just a whole series of challenges, not the least of which is, getting all the equipment set up, and we build it ourselves. And, everything that we have here and equipment wise is something that we put together out of materials that we acquired from food industry, stainless steel things and so forth. So we built all the equipment as well. So that was the pretty much the first year while we were getting the permits in place. We were cleaning up the building, painting, trying to get it in some sort of reasonable condition. But it's really tough to make an old concrete block building look beautiful. And then, Mother Nature again working 24/7. And so keeping the grounds, once we cleaned up some of the property, trying to keep it, keep the grass mowed and keep the weeds down, and just a never ending task.
Yeah, I heard on I think it was on Whiskey Lore back in 2020 when you were on with them, that it took something like half an hour to get through the front door the first time.
Yeah, that's right. The brush had grown. There was a big Asian honeysuckle growing right in the middle of the steps at the bottom there. And those things, the way they grow, they don't grow like a tree with a trunk where you just go and chop it off. They got all these branches sticking out, and you have to kind of go at it a little at a time to try to get to the heart of the thing. And and it was, I probably spent, maybe not full time, but the better part of 2 weeks just pulling vines off the building. And the vines that had been growing for 25 years. Just some of them are still literally stuck to the building. I mean, they're tenacious things. And, you know, I joke with people when they come in, I show them a picture of what the place looked like when I first got here. And I say, yeah, you know, you squint your eyes and you say, you know what, a little pressure wash and some paint, that'll look real nice. But again, it's just a kind of one of those things. And you were here, and of course, you know, people always ask, well, was there a fire? You know, what's all the black stuff around here? And then you explain whiskey mold and the fact that the barrels, you know, that are aging next door, the angels share, that mold feeds on the ethanol vapors, and it's, you know, it's relentless, and it's never ending. It's always going to be that way. And so trying to keep the place looking nice is probably the biggest challenge that we have.
And we should be clear, that mold's not really, it's not dangerous.
It's not the Stachybotrys black mold. No.
Yeah.
And, you know, it's interesting because it's a more recent phenomena. You know, it wasn't until distilleries started aging barrels on site in massive quantities that this mold would have shown up, you know, and of course that wouldn't have happened until these distilleries came along. And it wasn't until about 15 years or so ago, I read an article in Wired magazine, of all places, that a guy went over to Scotland, a Canadian guy went over to Scotland, as I recall, and they were trying to figure out what's this black stuff that seems to grow around distilleries all the time. And the issue is they couldn't grow the culture in a lab. They were trying to feed it regular mold food, whatever that would be, and it wouldn't work. And this guy finally thought, you know, this stuff seems to be around distilleries. I wonder if it likes alcohol. So he put some vodka in the petri dish, and it grew. And then he was able to identify what it was. And of course, then there was a lot of controversy around distilleries about their responsibility for the black stuff growing on people's homes and cars and furniture and whatnot. But you know, I get asked that all the time. So, well, there's people have been working around it now in the area for, you know, since the late 1800s, and there doesn't seem to be any adverse effects. You know, people that spent 40 years in the industry at these properties day in and day out. So, no, there doesn't seem to be any. But you know, just like other molds that are going around, is it possible that there's an allergy reaction or something like that? I suppose so, but nothing that we're aware of.
Yeah, there's always some kind of exclusion with that, but it was something I didn't hear about until I kind of saw it the first time, and that it wasn't even at Glens Creek. It was at I want to say it was at driving through the Heaven Hill property.
Yeah.
And pretty much every distillery I visited, as you said, as long as they're aging something on site, it's got that mold. Like every building on Heaven Hill had it. Wild Turkey has all of it.
Yeah.
Really, the only one that I saw that didn't was Bardstown Bourbon Company, but they're practically brand new compared to some of the warehouses. Yeah. So
they're too new.
Yeah, but they may, because their whole thing is visitor center and visitor friendly, they may find a way to counter it from growing. I don't know. I can kind of see them doing that.
If you keep your warehouses far enough away from your visitor center, you're fine. You know, I've heard that it can be as much as 1 mile radius. That really depends on prevailing wind direction and that sort of thing. And you know, that was something that struck me is when I first came out here. Like I said, you go to Castle and Key, and there's no blackness down there. The buildings were all clean. The stone was white, and you come down to here, and the distillery's got this blackness all over it. And it occurred to me that they haven't had barrels aging down there for 30 years, and down here we have had. And so I think they're going to experience it at some point. You know, I don't know how many barrels you have to have for it to show itself, but it's there. It's already there. You know, I try to explain to people that these molds, even yeast, these fungi, they create spores, and the spores are airborne, and they're literally everywhere. So if you go out in the middle of some place, deserted place and there's nothing there, and you start building warehouses and you put hundreds of thousands of barrels in there, in short order, there's going to be black mold. It's already there. It just doesn't have anything to eat. Mm. And so once you establish aging facility, and so this is a big controversy now that obviously people don't want aging facilities in their neighborhood. A lot of these neighborhoods grew up around some of these distilleries, and when they found out the distillery is responsible for that black stuff, there were some lawsuits and things like that. And so now when someone wants to put in another aging warehouse, Buffalo Trace is trying to get 24 warehouses for 60,000 barrels apiece in adjoining county, and of course the locals are opposed to that because they don't want the black mold all over everywhere. So it's a big controversial issue. We're down here in the valley, and there's really not the only places that are affected are the distilleries themselves. There's a couple houses down here, but they've been here forever.
Right. So, I mean, I'm fascinated by the history of it, and I don't remember if I told you this while I was down there, so what I did, just for the listeners, I did that tour a week in Kentucky and Tennessee, and I made sure to visit Glens Creek as part of that. I had a mini tour and tasting session with John. Didn't tell him who I was, nothing like that. I didn't want to influence him in any way. It was just wanted to have a good time and enjoy. And it was a great time. So definitely get down there if you have the chance. And afterwards, I went over to John and then to you, David, and just introduced myself, and just they didn't want to be like, oh yeah, I was there, and be like, well, why the hell didn't you say hi? But one of the other reasons that I really wanted to visit and wanted to know more about the brand, the site, and everything is that in terms of dusty bourbons or brands that no longer exist in their original format, Old Crow is really, it's probably my favorite. In terms of especially Old Crow from the National Distillers era, 50s, early 60s distillate. The Chessman pieces are, I collect them. I love them. It's kind of getting harder to find them, but
yeah,
love those. The Traveler, all those, and so there is quite a legacy that you have there, just in terms of place. And something we'll talk about when we talk about your products is that you do honor Doc Crow and Dr. Crow quite a bit in terms of what you try to do with the process and with the stories. And so I wanted to lead into the next kind of question, being each of your products has a story attached to it. Some might be true, some might be fabricated, and either way, they're incredibly entertaining. So who comes up with the stories and the descriptions for your products?
Well, the true stories I mostly do. I mean, I'll generally kind of rough up a draft and then have John and maybe the other guys look at it. There's a few folks who help out here part-time. They really enjoy being here and being involved in this process, and they have regular jobs during the week, and they come out and help out on the weekend. And one of those fellows, Stuart, he really liked to spin a yarn, and so the ones that we made up to partly to be humorous, but also to help educate people about puffery and the fact that a lot of things that you see and hear about the industry, about products, it's just not true. Puffery is a lawyer word that means an exaggeration or embellishment of some claim, and you can't dispute it. Therefore, you can't really file a lawsuit for false advertising. So if I say this bourbon is the smoothest bourbon in the world, you can't sue me over that. Well, you could sue me, but you won't win. Okay, because there's really no way to prove or disprove that statement. And so on a couple of our products, we just really made up the most outlandish story that we possibly could people that give people a laugh, and we say, oh yeah, Soti vodka, centuries old recipe, first distilled by Commodore Borislav Alexander Soti of the Swiss Romanian Navy. And then you stop for a second, and some people, if you say it seriously enough, they believe there's a Swiss Romanian Navy. And so then John got a map to put on the wall that, we circled Switzerland and Romania, and we point to it and say, look, guys, they don't have a Navy together.
Right.
Okay, Switzerland's landlocked. They do have a Navy. Switzerland does have a Navy, but they don't share it with Romania. And so we created those stories in jest, for fun, but also to help people understand that what they read on the labels is not necessarily true. Okay, that there's a lot of non-distilling producers, a lot of source brands, and there's nothing wrong with that practice. We do it. We source a few things from MGP, and but we're clear about it. And it's just my feeling that people want transparency if they're coming to a small place like this, where they believe that the people that they're talking to are the ones who actually make the product, that should be the case. Or if it's something we don't make, we disclose that. We say, look, MGP makes great products. They make a lot of it. They're in an endless number of products out there on the market. If they didn't make good products, they wouldn't exist. And certainly at their scale, they're enormous. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah. And the other part you said too, it's incredibly important to me to honor the legacy of the place and the origins. Dr. Crow never saw this facility. He passed in 1856, and this was built in 1870s. So he never actually saw this particular facility, but the legacy of the brand, and as you said, it was probably the top selling brand for 125 years. Subtract Prohibition out of that time period, but certainly from the 1935 renovation going through till the end. And yes, I've had some of the Old Crow from the 50s and 60s, and it was quite nice. And, just trying to honor that legacy and not create, a reproduction of Disney World or something here. But I mean, this was an industrial facility. This was a workhorse. They produced 400 barrels of Old Crow a day. And there was a lot of people who worked here, who spent their careers here. And we also really want to honor that. There's a lot of people that put in a lot of time and energy into making this place what it was and what it is. And so we want to honor that.
No, I think, we'll get into the products, like I said, but I honestly think you do, having tasted the Old Crow stuff and of course tasting your products. They're not one-to-one comparison. It's not the same product, of course. Right. There's too many things that have changed since then, but the idea and the process behind it, from what I know of Old Crow and of James Crow, it seems to fit pretty well. So with that, I thought, maybe we'll go into the process a bit. And so you are a process guy.
I am.
You spent a decade plus at Toyota, and then been consulting for a decade plus after that.
Right.
I saw you were the author of the Toyota field.
The Toyota Way Field book. Yes.
Yeah. So, number one, I'm going to be looking for a car. No, I'm just kidding. I'm kidding. But when you were coming over, and as you said, you don't have a huge distilling background, you're coming over to this distillery and you want to create a brand and everything. What did you take from your time at Toyota and in consulting that helped you formulate what you have now?
Yeah, that's a great question. The Toyota process focuses a lot on this concept of standardization and process controls. And, if you're creating something, manufacturing something, there's certain aspects of the process that you have to pay attention to and control, whether that's a time, temperature, pressures, that sort of thing. And, when I was distilling and started distilling, I realized that there's just a tremendous number of variables, and most of those variables you really have little or no control over whatsoever. And so then I kind of reflected on this, that humans have distilled things for about 2,000 years, and they've been fermenting since before written history. And so, my first thought then was, well, how complicated can it be if people did this for 2,000 years before science got involved? The microscope was invented in the 1670s. So prior to that, people were fermenting without really understanding what they were doing. They just knew that if they followed certain steps, certain things would occur. And it's a natural process. Yeast is also in the air everywhere, and all it needs is food. If yeast spore falls on food somewhere, it's going to start to do its job. And so I took that approach that, keep it basic. Doesn't have to be complicated. It can be. In the modern world, you have automation and you have all these other technologies that you can use. And those are important if you have a very, very large distillery where you're trying to control the massive quantities of product. But the old school way with a pot still is fairly basic. And, there's lots of variations. There's probably as many ways to configure a still as there are people who are distilling, and there's a lot of people who distill at home, and so that's how I know. You can see all these different variations, and so I experimented a lot. That's one of the things from Toyota. Is you have an idea about something. Can you perform some small experiment rapidly, if possible, and prove or disprove the hypotheses, right? That you formulate the hypotheses, and scientific method says you're supposed to try to disprove it. And if you can't disprove it, then it must be true. And so, I had no knowledge whatsoever, David. I started this with absolutely zero understanding of fermentation, of distillation, of any of it. I mean, you would have had to look really hard to find somebody who knew less about alcohol or the process of production of alcohol than me. Okay. And that was the state. But I like making things. It's what I'm good at. And it's what I've done throughout my career. Is involved in all my hobbies had to do with making things, or woodworking and welding and pottery and glass blowing. And, I've done all those various things. And so, and I had very little risk. I mean, I had a small still, and I was doing really small quantities and just experimenting with different things and trying different things, and, reading and watching YouTube. And, it took me a while, but I discovered that a lot of what I'm going to call common knowledge that people were spreading around about how to do it was wrong. It was just incorrect. The one thing I kept hearing over and over again was, well, you don't want to use wild yeast. And I thought, well, factory yeast is a relatively recent phenomena in human history. And people have been fermenting for thousands of years without really understanding what they were doing. So what could be wrong with doing that? And so I was explaining that to John about yeast spores and how spores can be viable and remain viable for no one knew how long exactly, decades, centuries, millennia, who knows. And John suggested, well, maybe some of the old crow yeast is still in the distillery, and maybe we can go catch some. So, well, catching is not that hard. You just cook up some mash. And so we cooked up a small batch of mash in some buckets, and we put those buckets in various locations in the distillery, and went back a week later and discovered, well, that bucket got attacked by raccoons and pigeons and groundhogs and possums, and so the only one that survived the ordeal without contamination was the one that we put down in fermenter number 5 back in the distillery. And it seemed logical to me that if you were going to find yeast spores somewhere, they would be inside a giant fermenter, 39,000 gallon fermenter, might have a spore or two in it. And so that sample actually was fermenting. And so I brought it up, and I didn't have a microscope at that time. So I was just, flying by the seat of my pants, basically, and said, well, I don't know how much yeast is in there, but it's probably not enough yet. So to grow yeast, you continue to feed it, give it food and give it nutrients, and it's like any other living organism. So I had this little setup, and if you want yeast to focus on reproduction, you want to aerate the liquid. I mean, yeast is primarily an anaerobic organism, but if you aerate the liquid, and generally in the liquid there's some dissolved oxygen that the yeast can use. It needs a little bit of oxygen, but when you aerate it, it focuses more on reproduction and less on alcohol production. So in general, you never want to aerate your mash because you want the yeast to focus on making ethanol. But in the case of growing my culture, I bought a little fish tank aerator and dropped it down in the jug, and I had this whole process going on. So I did that for about a month, and I figured then, okay, I probably have enough now, and we can start using it for our fermentations. And that's what we still use now. Yeast mutates, and we open ferment, so there's also the addition of other wild yeast potentially that are in there. So people always ask me if it's, is it the original Old Crow yeast? I said, well, I don't really know because I don't have the Old Crow yeast to do a DNA analysis on, but that's how it came to be. But, if what humans did for thousands of years was spontaneous fermentation, you prepare the food and you leave it open to the air, and the yeast spores fall in and they start to do their work. And that same thing happens here. I mean, it happened yesterday and as we start going into the cooler months and our cooked mash cools down more quickly, the opportunity for spontaneous fermentation increases. So I cook it today, leave it out overnight, come back in tomorrow morning, and when the temperature is cold, and you can look and see that it's already fermented before I even add any of our yeast to it. So. And that's the way it would have been done during Dr. Crow's time. And so I think, you're correct. There's not a exact comparison between what we're doing and what Old Crow was doing. First of all, they were using a continuous column still, but the old school ways, they'd use a column still for the stripping run to eliminate the majority of the water, and then they would take the result and put that in what they called a doubler, which is effectively works like a pot still. And so the outcome would be more similar to a pot still. And today's distilleries typically don't do that. The column stills are designed to do finished product in a single run. So it's a little bit different in today's world.
And I definitely encourage people to listen to episodes that I'm referencing, pardon me, from other podcasts and shows that David has been on, where we talked about the site at Woodford, and just the dimensions of how they had to have been using pot still or even a slight coffee still, because there's not enough room for a column still.
That's right.
Over there. So I definitely listened to his episodes at Whiskey Lore and Blue Collar Bourbon. For those are just two of the ones that I listened to just to prepare for this, and it was tons of great information there that let me skip some of that information so that we can dive a little deeper into some other parts of the process, which I love to do. Yeah. So one more question with the yeast. I know this might have been answered kind of implicitly, but have you thought of asking like Pat Heist or Shane Baker over at Firm Solutions to kind of run your yeast through their spectrometers and see if there's any modern equivalent? Because I know it might be hard to or even impossible to find exactly the one that they would have been using 30, 40, 50 years ago, or even a series of them. But I would be curious, just as a nerd that I am, to see, are your yeast strains aligning with someone else's or some other ones?
No, that's a good question, and I haven't thought about that. I met Pat years ago and certainly know about firm solutions. But that might be something that we can look into in the future. And that it's one of those questions, that I look at and go, well, if you go to any distillery, winery, brewery, or if you look at that and you ask, well, what kind of yeast do you use? Well, it's Saccharomyces cerevisiae, right? Every one is the same name. How do you really indicate that there's a difference between them? And this is probably old now, but 10 years ago, I'd read and say, well, they've identified 100,000 varieties of yeast and estimate that there's 1 million varieties unidentified. And they mutate. And so that might be a difficult question, but I can certainly check. And there's a repository that's in Greenland, I believe it is, where they've got all these various organisms in this cold storage scenario. Who knows? I know that the yeast they used here was known as Y174. That's what it was. That was the name. And National may have set some of that aside in that repository or something, the original yeast. But we kind of go with the notion that we're all, and this is the part that kind of I scratch my head, is you go to one of the big distilleries and they've got this big open fermentation vat, and they talk about their special yeast. And I said, well, I think to myself, well, you don't think you're ever getting any strains from the air in there? Because certainly we know yeast floats around in the air. If you want to ferment something in your place up there in New York, all you have to do is put the food out on the table. But, oh, by the way, put a little vinegar in there so that it doesn't spoil. Yeast likes an acidic environment. And, put some fermentable sugars out on your counter, and guess what? You'll catch some yeast. Now, what kind it is? Well, it's Saccharomyces cerevisiae, right? Which strain, so yeah. I don't have the PhD in it like Pat does, but I just look at it from a practical standpoint and say, look, when I was experimenting, I tried probably 50 different kinds of yeast. I went to the local liquor store, and they had the home brew, home wine making section there. And so I tried all those. I tried Fleischmann's yeast, Distiller's active dry yeast, champagne yeast, wine yeast. I tried them all, and they all worked just fine. And honestly, I couldn't tell any real difference in the product. But part of that too is the nature of a pot still, is that you're going to get variation in the outcome based on many, many things. One of which is the fermented mash that you put in, of course, and the grains, the mash bill, the yeast itself. But the way pot stills operate is that there's a lot of variation in the outcome. And I don't know, maybe my tongue's not sophisticated enough to say, oh yes, I can definitely detect that note is from that yeast. You take, so when you're creating the mash, it's sour mash. And the reason it's sour is because during fermentation, there's also bacterial fermentation. There's two primary bacteria, lactobacillus and acetobacter. And acetobacter is the one that eats ethanol and makes vinegar. Okay, so acetobacter and yeast have had a symbiotic relationship for probably millions of years. Yeast likes the acidic environment because that keeps other organisms out of its food. Other organisms don't live in that environment. So that's why you can have things like mustard on your kitchen counter without refrigeration, because it has vinegar in it. Vinegar is a preservative. But that's a natural part of the fermentation process. And if you're open fermenting like we do, certainly you're inviting that bacteria to be part of that. And if you do like we do, transfer yeast from one fermenter while it's active to the next fermenter, you're also transferring those bacteria. And then sour mashing is taking the liquid from the still that's left over and putting that into the next batch to lower that pH. because if we don't lower the pH, then the yeast is going to exert some of its energy to create acids. The yeast wants an acidic environment, and we don't want the yeast to use its energy for that. So we use the setback to acidify that liquid, to drop that pH down to around 5, and that gives yeast a conducive environment. And so that was something that Dr. Crow's credited with perfecting or standardizing. He didn't really invent the process, but he brought some science to the situation. And so that's how we do our mash. And you know, you talk to some folks, and they're going to tell you that your microbiome, the organisms that you have in your environment, are all part of what goes into your final product and the taste of the product. And so we do some things that other distilleries, I think, would shudder. You know, Pat, I have always joked, if Pat Heist were to come over here, he'd probably have a heart attack, because we do things that I was told you're not supposed to do. That's what I told you in the beginning. People said, well, you should never use wild yeast. So what did we do? We went out and did exactly that. You shouldn't stress out your yeast. Don't let it get too hot. Don't do this. Don't do that. And I said, well, you see, that's the thing. If the yeast gets a little bit stressed out, it produces some esters. And people make the mistake, I think, of, you know, they stick their finger in the mash and they taste the mash, and then they determine that, oh, that mash got contaminated somehow and it just doesn't taste good or doesn't smell right. And you know, that a lot of the home distillers are going to toss that out because they're afraid that it's spoiled. I said, no, put that in the still, because in the still, you're going to get these different wonderful chemical reactions, because the alcohol molecules, ethanol, methanol, propanol, and so forth, that are created during fermentation, those molecules loved, I call them promiscuous molecules, because they love to bond with other molecules and create new things. And some of those things have great taste. It always amazes me. You put sour mash. I mean, if you put your finger in and you taste it, it's sour. Not quite sour as vinegar, but it's pretty sour. And then what comes out of the still has a sweetness to it. So I put sour in the still and I get sweetness out of the still. And that's because of those chemical reactions. When you concentrate the alcohol molecules, they start to bond with some of the other molecules and create new things. And those things have flavor. Well, then you're going to take that and put it in a barrel, and the whole equation is going to change again. And then with some oxidation, you get some changes again. And so there's just, to me, there's just way too many steps between, you know, the yeast fermenting and the final product that you taste to be able to backtrack to the yeast and say, that's what did it. And it certainly contributes, but the environment you have the yeast in, you know, the nutrition level that the yeast is in, all those things are going to affect the outcome. That's what I told you, to bring this around full circle. As a process guy who spent a career really thinking about how to effectively control process, to come into this environment where you have very little, if any, control whatsoever. If you think you're in control, you're delusional. Nature is in control here. Now, we can control certain things when we operate the still. We can regulate the temperatures and so forth. But in terms of the first parts, the fermentation and even the grain, you know, even if you grow your own grain, you don't have control. It's going to vary. The grain's going to be different as you harvest it once per year, but you use it all year. So the storage conditions that the grain is in is going to affect things. There's just billions, really literally billions of potential variables that exist in the process itself.
And to our point earlier too, that's why we can't truly recreate some of these quote unquote dusty bourbons or whiskeys, because there are just too many variables that exist.
That's absolutely right.
Yeah. And one of them, and I'll just throw this in there, that's one of my favorite mini topics specific to Old Crow as well, is that I was on a Zoom with Freddie No probably about a year and a half ago at this point. It was at a point where I knew I liked the National Distillers Era Old Crow, but I didn't really understand why. And I was interested to figure out why. And he had said that, you know, of course, Beam owns the Old Crow brand. And he personally was saying that he would love to try to recreate Old Crow as it was in the 40s, 50s, 60s. He said uh, one of the main obstacles to that was, of course, the chemical structures as well. One of them being ethyl carbamate.
Mm-hmm.
And it being now it's labeled as a carcinogen. And it is at a certain level. I don't think at the level that Old Crow was, that era Old Crow had, but I'm not a doctor. But but the point being that it creates a certain mouthfeel too, and a texture to the bourbon that made an 80 or 86 or even bottled and bond proof bourbon significantly heftier, gave it much more body, because it's a urethane molecule. It's going to do that. It's going to create something that's heavier, but you're not allowed to have that same level anymore, even though it's a natural byproduct of fermentation. So that's all to say that, again, it's another reason why we can't exactly recreate, but if you get to taste true Old Crow stuff, it's that's one of the reasons why it tastes why it does, and it doesn't taste like thin corn distillate instead. Hey, Whiskey Ringers. I hope you've been taking advantage of that podcast-only code for the Scotch Malt Whiskey Society. They've got around 20 bottlings coming out each month, and there's never a shortage of new things to explore. This month's focus, their October distillery dive, is Distillery Number 5. This famous lowland distillery will show you something completely different, and you've probably never had before. This isn't your floral and fruity Speyside, but it's also not that smoky, sometimes medicinal and maritime Islay. It's truly unique and in a category and region all its own. The Distillery Dive bottlings were announced on October 11th, so you might still find some available. If not, keep an eye out. There are always more bottles coming from this distillery and others, and always new journeys to explore. There are also currently 5 fall bundles available, packaging multiple bottles together from sometimes the same and sometimes different distilleries into a discounted set for you to discover. Remember to use the promo code WRP for 20% off your annual membership, and you can visit the Scotch Malt Whiskey Society website to sign up and order via the link in the show notes.
Well, in this world, there's usually two sides of the coin and two stories. Actually, Old Crow was known to have less EC than some of the other counterparts of national distillers. And I know that because the gentleman who used to be the superintendent here at Old Crow, he visits us regularly, and we've talked about that regularly. And my understanding is that was kind of one of the contributing factors of why Beam wanted to acquire Old Crow brand, is because the barrels that were aged here could be mixed together with other barrels to reduce the overall level of ethyl carbamate. And now I'll have to get you in contact with Bob, and maybe he'd agree to a podcast because he's a chemical engineer. I'm not a chemical engineer, and he can talk about those more complex things. But my understanding from talking to Bob is what they did here that maybe was a little bit different. Like I said, they used a column still to do the stripping run. And for those who don't know, the stripping run is just an initial run where you kind of run it through a still, and the idea is to go from 8 or 9% alcohol by volume up to 30 or 40% by volume, and then you would do a finishing run in a secondary still. And the stills have come a long way since the time when this place was in operation, and so now they've got these continuous stills that'll put out a finished product without the need for the doubler. But you see, what they would do is they would do the stripping run one day, and they would put it in a collection tank and leave it overnight. And Bob says that time, and I think this is probably true, the time there allows some of those things, the volatile chemicals, to evaporate off, basically, and reduce that quantity. And coincidentally, we do something similar here. And I think, again, I'm not a scientist. I'm not a doctor. I just, I read and study and try to learn things. But what I know is that a lot of the chemicals that are present, well, all of them really, are volatile. And what people don't understand, it's that, look, the way a still operates, you got to understand, if you have a glass of water on the counter in your house at room temperature, it's basically operating like a still. The water is evaporating. The liquid is turning into a vapor, and it's leaving the glass. Now, water will do that all the way down to 33 degrees. Once it hits 32 degrees, of course, it turns to a solid. But even at 33 degrees, water will evaporate and become a vapor. And then if you have a glass of ice on the counter, that vapor will condense on the outside of the glass. And that's exactly what's happening in distillation. You're taking those volatile chemicals, water, alcohol, and so on, and you're applying heat to them, and you're causing them to vaporize more quickly than at room temperature. But if we leave our distillate overnight in the collection tank, which is not a sealed tank, then we're allowing some of those volatile chemicals to dissipate into the air, right? And so there's a lot to it, but you are correct that the EC is a natural byproduct of fermentation. There's a lot of things. I call it a chemical soup. Fermentation is like a chemical soup. There's a lot going on in there.
Yep, absolutely. So I think that leads perfectly into, I did want to ask you about the still. So you said, just set the context, one that you and the team fabricated the stills yourselves.
Right.
And I know I forget which episode it was, but you were talking about how like some of these craft distilleries are bringing in a still that's, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of dollars. And most places don't have that right off the bat to just throw towards one piece of equipment in the process. So the two questions I have that come from that are, number one, what was the fabrication process like? And perhaps before that, when you decided that you wanted to launch a distillery, who did you look to for inspiration, advice, and guidance on how to do so?
Yeah, great question. I'll answer the second one first because I don't want to forget it. I read books, I watched YouTube, looked at different things. I found a little book on Amazon called How to Make Whiskey, and I bought the book and I read it. And it's a guy named Brian Davis, who's out in California, had a distillery called Lost Spirits, and I just thought he just had a really practical approach to the whole thing. And so I reached out to him and I said, "Hey, Brian, here's what I'm trying to do, and would you be willing to give me some advice on putting together a business plan, helping me with the financial numbers?" Because I had no idea how that part worked. And so he and his partner agreed to help me, Brian, on the technical side, and she was helping with the numbers and putting together the business plan. And then I had an opportunity to fly out to California and visit with them, and talk to Brian, and a fascinating guy, because I said, "Brian, what's your background? Are you like a mechanical engineer or something?" He's like, "No, he's got a degree in fine art." And they had gone over to Spain and opened an absinthe distillery in Spain when absinthe was still illegal in the United States, and then eventually sold out and moved back to California to start a distillery there. But Brian, he's just got a real deep understanding of the technical part, but then his distillery is a work of art as well as distills. They had one that looked like a big dragon, so his line arm was like the head of a dragon and so on. But that's who really inspired me, so to speak. And What was the first question? See, now I knew I was going to forget one of the questions.
No, it's all right. I should have flipped them. That's totally fine. The first one was, what was the fabrication process like to create your stills?
You know, so there's a term that Toyota uses called Kaizen, and Kaizen is this concept of continuous improvement, but it's usually sort of incremental, and that's the process really that I went through. You know, I made a still, and I actually bought the line arm and condenser on eBay, just a real simple basic setup, and as I used it, then I started doing some modifications and more and I'd experiment with something and try something or learn something new from somewhere, and then kind of build it. But my background is a welder, and I can done a fair amount of electrical and plumbing work along the way, and so the copper that we use for the vapor and the condensers and so forth. It's all things you can acquire at the local store, and you can solder it and put it together if you have some basic skills. TIG welding was something that I learned when I was in school, and so that's our stills are stainless. We acquired stainless from the food industry somewhere along the way. I got a tank that came out of a facility that Jim Beam had in Cincinnati. I've got a tank. One of the stills is a tank from a soy sauce factory in Wisconsin, for example. They used to do soy sauce and brew soy sauce. So we acquired these things, and if I found a tank that was a reasonable price, stainless steel, something that was a very good price, I'd usually buy it and then figure out how to turn it into a still later. And so each of our stills is configured a little differently, but with the same basic idea. They have doublers. They have multiple doublers on the stills, and so we can get a finished run in one pass. We don't have to do multiple distillations because we have the doublers, and each time the vapor turns back to a liquid and back to a vapor is an additional distillation. So we're basically getting a triple distillation in a single pass. So there's a lot of trial and error. Not so much error. I mean, nothing ever really failed. It's just you try something and then you say, well, okay, if I do this next bit, it's known as cleaning up the spirit. So you just kind of you clean it up a little bit, and you're trying to eliminate some of the unpleasant things, whether those are things that have a certain taste or the proverbial bite or harshness or something like that. And so it was Brian actually who told me the first time I ran my still, I didn't know you were supposed to do a stripping run and a finishing run. I don't remember anybody ever saying that. So I ran the product through there and I tried it. And I thought, it tasted pretty good. I thought it was okay. The proof was pretty low. It was only about 90 proof. And so I was talking to Brian, and he said, well, did you do a finishing run? I said, what? And he said, you did a stripping run, and did you do a finishing run? I said, what are you talking about? I had no clue. And so that's when, and it was actually Brian who suggested to me, well, put an additional doubler on there and see what it'll do. And I thought, okay. I mean, that's how I operate with stuff. Somebody says, well, just like your suggestion to reach out to Pat Heiser. Well, okay, I never really thought about that, but maybe I'll explore that. And so that's kind of how I approached building the stills. And after you operate the still a number of times, you realize, I could have put this over here. It would have made it a little easier to use. But in terms of functionality, it produces the product that you want. In terms of ease of use, the last still that actually John built, the most recent still we have called America. And I really like setting it up because the way it's set up, coincidentally, the space he had to put it in, it's all along the wall. So everything, my other stills, I got to do circles around the stills because some parts of it are over there and some parts of it are over there, and you kind of have to work around. But that still, everything's right there, and it's very easy and quick and efficient to set up. So, I think, well, all right, in the future, if you're going to design and build a still, use that basic concept for the future stills. So it was an evolution, the Kaizen, and to this day we continue to learn. You get an idea, you get a notion, or suddenly something comes to mind, and you say, okay, let's improve that. Why didn't we think about that before? And the nature of Kaizen sort of is that the idea comes to you when it's ready. And if you could hit a state of perfection on the very first try, you would. But of course, it's a constant journey that you're moving, trying to always get better. And sometimes it's the thing people don't understand is sometimes it's just not worth the trouble to get a little bit better. It's more trouble than it's worth, as they say. But if you can change something, we not long ago we were exploring the idea of because one of our biggest, besides distilling, the other big energy user is cooking of the grain, and of course you're heating up a pretty large quantity of water to do that. And we'd always used a certain amount of water based on what common recipes out there people talk about. And started asking the question, well, what if we used a little bit less water? We'd have less to heat up, we'd have less to handle and process. And then if you can increase the alcohol percentage a little bit, then you get a better, more efficient run in the still. And so we started exploring that. And the benefit of being small like we are is we can do a quick experiment. We can say, oh, well, let's cut the water back by 20% today and run a little experiment and see how it affects the fermentation and the distillation. And within a week or so, we can have the answer and we can make a decision about whether we want to continue to do that or not. And have a saying that everything's a trade-off too. You learn that. You say, okay, you change something and you get a benefit, but there's also some negative side to it. That's just the way of the world. Okay, you make an improvement, but you also discover, oh, okay, there's a little bit of a drawback to that improvement. Makes this step a little bit more difficult, or this step takes longer or something. And so then you have to look at it overall and decide whether that the positive outweighs the negative and whether you should continue to do that or not. And so that's the main thing that that's what I learned at Toyota, is how to do these experiments and how to make these decisions, because there's no right or wrong answer to any of the questions. There's a decision. And that's what I'm telling you is there's as many ways to think about distilling as there are people distilling. And there's a lot of people distilling. And there's some carryover. People have these notions about the correct way to do it. So, well, there's more than one correct way. There's more than one way that you can accomplish a good outcome. And, this is what we do. This is how we do it. But if we discover something that's going to improve our process, we're certainly willing to change that. And that's kind of the takeaway from my Toyota and consulting experience.
And it's a great way to think about things. Thought of is just, you've got to sometimes just take the step back, and that's when the idea will come to you.
Mm-hmm.
So I found it's a fascinating philosophy. It's something that all of us do on a daily basis, but it's not necessarily something we consciously think about or has been articulated. So I just wanted to mention that.
No, that's a great point. I think part of the challenge sometimes, and this is where the outside eyes can be beneficial, because when you do the task every day, the task just seems normal to you. You don't really reflect on, is there a better way? Could there be a more efficient way or something? But somebody whose brain hasn't developed that acceptance can look at it and say, oh, here's another possibility. And so, what you described there is exactly what I try to tell people. Writing the books, creating anything. I mean, that's what my past has been, the pottery, the glass blowing, those are creative aspects, and you can't force it. You can't force yourself to be in a creative place. It's it's a right brain activity. And so it's, trying not to try. I'm going to look that one up. And drunk. You've got two things I got to read now. But yeah, it's interesting to me because having really, I don't like to say preached that concept for so many years, but certainly taught it and talked about it. It's interesting to me when I had that realization, we could do this. And then I stop and look and say, why did it take 6 years to figure that out? Why did it take 6 years for that realization to come to mind? And of course, there's no answer. It did, because it's time, or you just never took the time to contemplate that or whatever, And so when I usually say something like the ideas floating around in the room, and when it's time to come, it's going to, hit you in the head. But that's the nature of the Kaizen concept too. It's not something you sit down and say, what do I need to improve? It's something that you have a realization that something is a pain in the neck or it's difficult or whatever. And then you think, okay, what can I do to make that better? So anyway.
Well, there will definitely be a follow-up email that I'm going to send to you anyway, just with audio and anything else. And there are a couple questions I know we're not going to get to, just because I have a full page and a half of them. So there's nowhere to get all of them, but I'll include drunk and try not to try on there. And also, I don't know why this idea just came to me, but the way you were describing the idea is kind of floating in the air. When the time is right, it will come to you and attach to you. For me, that also parallels how the yeasts work, and it's just floating all in the air. And when it finds the right environment, it's going to find that right environment.
Yep.
So there are a couple of your products that I really do want to mention before we close out. But before we get to that, I have to ask you about mash bill, and I really want to. I think this came up on both episodes that I spoke about. The idea that, yes, you have a mash bill generally that you go to, the Cuervito Vivo is, about a 70-20-10, and there are other mash bills by product. But when you were asked, like, what's the percentages, what's the mash bill about that, you threw out the percentage, but you really said, like, the way that we're looking at it, and I think this was for the Cuervito and probably for the OCD, it's 600 pounds of corn, 60 pounds of rye, 30 pounds of barley.
Yep, that's OCD.
That's OCD. Okay. So, if you're looking at that you can work out the numbers as to what percentages that are, but I guess I was asking how did you come to that percentage or that mash recipe? And then, so, let's start with that question. How did you come to that recipe in particular?
Well, I'd love to tell you that our marketing department and our distilling department and all those, we sat down and we had endless meetings and committees and so on. And I'd love to be able to tell you, well, if you're going to create a mash bill, you also have to consider the economics of it. But the reality is that, as I mentioned earlier, I did just a lot of experiments. I made pear brandy. I fermented Welch's grape juice. I fermented molasses and made rum. In the beginning, it had a little bit to do with what grains could I get a hold of, and had to get a mill so that I could mill those grains, because you can go to the local feed supply and they might have rye, but it's not milled. So then you got to kind of grind it yourself and do all these things. And so I was just experimenting, and honestly, I don't remember how we ultimately just came to that 660-30. In retrospect, it probably would have been better to go 650-50, or because our grains come in 50-pound bags, so we have to weigh out. If we've got 60 pounds, we get one bag plus 10 pounds, and so we we had to take some time to weigh out some of them. The 70-20-10, the Cuervito, that's a recreation of Old Crow. That was the percentage that Old Crow was. And, when we crunched the numbers, it was like, okay, I don't remember what it was going to be. It was going to be 140 pounds of rye or something like that. It's just like, you know what, just make 3 50-pound bag, making 150 pounds even, and, simplify that. So we're not having to weigh out the grains all the time. So it's not exactly 70-20-10, it's 500 pounds of corn, 150 pounds of rye, and 70 pounds of barley. So on the 70, we're still measuring it out. But the way we do the cook is we split it into 2 totes. And so each tote gets 35 pounds of barley, which I would have to weigh out anyway because of the way we split it up. And the cob, the A-maize-ing COB, that recipe, that one took a long time because it's 100% corn. I mean, we spent countless hours coming up with that recipe. But no, actually the way it happens is John stopped me one day and he says, are you aware that we're out of rye? And I was like, no. And you can't just snap your fingers and get some delivered. So he says, what would happen if we just used all corn? And I said, I don't know, let's try it. And, so a lot of things just happen that way. It's just that happened to have been a happy accident. I, failed to get some rye. And so we said, what happens if we just use 100% corn? That's a unique idea. Let's try it. And all of our products are unique from the beginning. They all have a different mash bill. We don't have a shared mash bill for any of our products. And so the wheated bourbon was simply change wheat for rye on the OCD and use the same proportions of corn and barley. Just swap it out. And then Cafe au lait uses a roasted barley, and so we just use roasted barley instead of the standard barley. So those were all intentional things. But like I said, if we have an idea, we can cook up a batch and we can have it fermented and then be in the still within about a week or 10 days. And then if you taste it at the still and you like the way it tastes, you can keep going, continue to make it. One of the fellows who helps out here on weekends, Tom, earlier this year asked if I'd ever considered using any of the heirloom corns, the red, white, and blue corns. And I said, well, it's a financial implication because the red corn costs about $1 a pound, for instance, whereas yellow number 2 corn, it's $9 for 50-pound bag. Oh. And so if you're going to create a product that's significantly more expensive, it needs to taste really good. And I'm not sure about those corns. I never experimented with those because I didn't have access to those. But I said, look, let's buy a couple tons and we'll do a test. And so we decided to continue with that, but to do it on a annual basis. And he created a product we call Patriotic COB. So it's again 100% corn, but it's a combination of red, white, and blue corn. And then he also wanted to do a multi-grain product. So we created a 7-grain product. Now those will be distilled only once per year because the grain is quite expensive. And we'll release those. Our plan is to release those sometime at 4th of July because Patriotic COB's red, white, and blue. And so we can do that, and if the cost of those grains is significantly higher, and the way we process the grains, that 7-grain one was very difficult to run through our process. And so if we can't make that easier, that's a decision going forward. Is like, oh, maybe it makes a good product, but it's a pain in the ass. And are we gonna continue to do that? Hopefully, I can say that word on your podcast because your listeners are all 21 or older, right?
Yeah, we're all 21 and older. I mark everything explicit because I don't want to have to go out there and put a bleep over a fuck or something like that, So if it could, some guests are more profane than others. I'll throw that out there,
Yeah.
but no, it's not a big deal at all. With the So just to go through a couple that you just mentioned, I mean, the A-maize-ing COB I got to try. I do want to note you were very generous with supplying samples to try, and I really appreciate that. Of course, it doesn't, influence my ratings or anything like that. But having said that, some of your products, particularly the bourbons that I tried, are up there for my just top things that I've tried this year. And I think every person that I mention bourbon to, I've been mentioning you guys for that reason.
Yeah.
So the COB was, of course, corn whiskey. There aren't a lot of 100% corn whiskeys out there. Most of them are closer to the 80% corn, just by regulation, by minimum required by regulation, I should say. And it was different than other corn whiskeys. And I really, I'll elaborate that in a written tasting notes and review, but it was different in the best way.
Well, first of all, it is a bourbon. It's not a corn whiskey. It's a bourbon.
Oh, it's bourbon. Okay.
Yeah. And that's one thing that confuses people a lot, because corn whiskey has to be at least 80% corn. So the assumption is once you pass 80%, it automatically becomes corn whiskey. I said, no, you really need to look at the regulation. And unfortunately, the wording in the regulation, the way it's wording, I think they need a comma, because it says for corn whiskey, the regulation says, and if stored, whereas all the other whiskeys say must be stored. So first thing is corn whiskey could be sold clear.
Right.
It doesn't have to go into a charred oak container. It can't go in a charred oak container. In fact, the law says that, and if stored in new or used, or is it used or new uncharred barrels. And so people assume that you can put it in a used bourbon barrel. But the law goes on to say that corn whiskey may not come in contact with charred wood in any fashion. So corn whiskey has to be aged in a non-charred container, whereas all the other whiskeys must be stored in a new charred oak container. Okay, so that's the difference between corn whiskey and bourbon. There's no upper limit. Bourbon and all the other whiskeys simply say at least 51% of the primary grain. They don't say a maximum. See, so it is a bourbon, and it is 100%, and we do store it in a new charred oak container, just like our other bourbons, and it is unique. And I think all of our products are unique in that, because just like I explained to people, I said, when I started distilling, and I was 50 whatever years old, everything I'd ever consumed in my life, for the most part, came from a column still. And a column still is going to produce a different type of finished spirit. I mean, it's just things like the mouthfeel, and 80 proof as well. If you're gonna be at 80 proof, you have to chill filter, and that's going to change the mouthfeel. When you run a pot still and you put it at 110, 120 proof or something, you get a completely different texture in the mouth, because you have the fatty acids are still present. So there's just a lot of things about our products that are going to be unique in terms of how they taste or how they come across. Now, and I do tell people, that doesn't mean you're going to like every one of them. I don't expect anyone to like every one. And it would be normal for you to say, oh, I really like one more than the other, or, oh, that one comes across as really unique, and I like that fact, or whatever the case may be. And certainly, as you well know, because you're putting yourself out there in the world, that if you can't take a little bit of criticism from time to time, you really shouldn't be putting yourself out there.
100%.
And that's, if somebody doesn't care for the products, I understand that. And it's perfectly okay. Not everybody's going to drink hard spirits anyway. And, some people, they come in here and they let it be known, well, I really am a beer person. Well, okay, then probability of you enjoying our products is probably lower. And that's fine, that it's okay. But yeah, I have to say too that I got your information from Jeff Schwartz, who I've never actually formally met, but I appreciate the fact that both of you guys make it pretty clear. And I read some of your stuff about the fact that if you're going to review something, you're going to give your honest feedback about it. And that's the only feedback I want. I don't want somebody to tell me that, oh, this is really great, if they don't care for it. And, I think I'm reasonable enough. And with folks here, we try before we put something in a bottle, we select barrels, we choose which barrel we're going to put in a bottle, which one we think is ready. And I think that, that we're sensible enough and honest enough to be able to say, look, if it's not ready, we're not going to bottle it yet. Mm-hmm. But I also can tell you from sitting at that tasting table with so many people over the years that first of all, our distillate comes out of the still tasting good. It's going to go in a barrel and it's going to come out tasting better. The barrel's never going to ruin the whiskey unless we do something really unusual with where we store the barrel. But the barrel itself is never going to cause the product to be bad. So it's never, when we taste the barrel, there's never a question of, is it good? The question really is it ready? Do we think the barrel has contributed enough to the whiskey to appeal to people? And if it appeals to us, we assume that it's going to appeal to other people as well. But again, not everyone. And not everyone's going to like everything, or somebody's going to say, the cafe au lait, they're going to say, oh, I really don't like coffee. And that roasted barley is giving that a little bit of a coffee note that I don't care for. Okay, yeah, fair enough. And other people say, oh, I really like that. It comes in on the back. I really like how that coffee / dark chocolate comes in on the back of that. So, okay. And there's no right or wrong answer to what you like. You like what you like. And we make a variety of different products. I think we have people are quite often amazed, and they look and they say, wow, for a small distillery, you really have a large lineup. And I said, well, yeah, maybe because the two of us, John and myself, maybe we have a little ADD-ness in us, and we get bored easily and we want to try something different. And last year I started doing blue agave, sort of got the idea, say, hey, you know what, maybe we should try some tequila. We can't call it tequila, but that's essentially what it is. And for me, the objective with all of that, you create a new product, is really, is it possible to create something that you're proud enough of, that you think is good enough of, that you want to put out there, and that people will actually enjoy and appreciate. And what you're doing with your work is the same kind of thing. Is you obviously you want to create something that people are going to appreciate. And so with the notion of the agave was like, I don't know, I've never tried it. Can we somehow figure out how to make an agave spirit that appeals to people? Sure, let's try. And so that's kind of how it operates. But yeah, it was Jeff. I learned about you through Jeff, and when I realized and could see in your work that you're straight up about it, and you can be critical without being mean and nasty. You don't have to say mean things. You just have to share your views of it. And and there's, as you're aware, there's probably a lot of reviews and things that are going on out there that people. I've read some reviews of some places where you can see that people are trying to be kind and not be too critical, but they really might need to be a little more critical.
There's definitely a fine line, and while I appreciate everything you said, it's, as you know from your position, it's not an easy line to walk sometimes. And I've said this elsewhere, that if I write a quote unquote bad or a negative review about something from Heaven Hill, they can handle that. There's so many many people writing about them, they can handle that. But if it's a smaller distillery, I really do try to, if I really don't like something, like let's say I try something and I just hate it, then I'll talk to you offline and say, like, okay, I really didn't like this one. Maybe I won't put a review up of it, but I also want to figure out, like, why didn't I like it? But if it's something that anything other than that, like if it's something that I love, something that I like, something that I think has promise but needs a little more, that's when I really, like I said, I want to write about where something is now, but also give plenty of context for the reader. If there's someone who've never heard of Glens Creek, never gotten to try it or go down there and listen to you or John or anyone else talk about these products while you're tasting them, then you're just going to look at it and say it's a bourbon from Kentucky. Maybe you know the mash bill. Maybe you know how old or young it is, depending on what it is. And you're going to make a judgment call based on that.
Yeah.
And if there's more that I can put in there in the review, that's why, honestly, when I write a review, I consider the paragraphs above it far more important than the actual tasting notes in the final rating.
Yeah.
Because you've got to know that context first. Otherwise, it's just a number, and everyone's numbers are different.
Right. Yeah. Well, it's interesting because I sent the samples to Jeff, and the one that he didn't care for at all was Cuervito Vivo, and I told him his response was he said I just can't find anything about it that I like, and I told him, and I didn't take that personally. I told him, I said, that's really kind of interesting because that's actually our best seller. People tend to really like that one, and the OCD. Those are kind of neck and neck. But that's the deal, is we don't all like the same things. We don't all like the same movies or books or food or whatever. And if somebody doesn't care for a particular one, in his case, I just thought that was interesting because that is the one that people usually taste and go, oh, I really like that one, or that one's really smooth, or whatever comments like that. But I also try to let people know these are single barrels, so there's going to be some variation barrel to barrel. The benefit, I think, here, David, is when people sit down and they taste something, I point out to them, this is barrel whatever number, and you see behind me, that's the one that I'm going to sell, so that you're going to go home with exactly what you taste. If you really like that particular one, that's the one you go home with. It's not, you're going to get something different. You're going to get home and open it up and say, well, gee, that doesn't taste anything like it did at the distillery. Right. And so that's something that's important to us too. And a constant challenge, because when we get to the end of the barrel and we've only got a few bottles left, we try to, consolidate that in one place so that we can make sure that what you taste is what you would get. And so therefore, if you try something and it just doesn't appeal to you, then you don't have to buy it, right? You don't. Sure. It's fine. And I think there's a difference. I explained to people, I said, look, there is a category out there that I call awful or terrible or whatever word. And you have to quantify that. You have to be able to say, look, if I gave 100 people a sample of this, 90% would agree it's just bad. Something's wrong. Can't put my finger on what it is, but it's just not good. And that's different from what you kind of were talking about is if you don't care for a particular distillery's basic flavor profile, that's preference. Mm-hmm. But if you say, well, I don't really care for, say, Four Roses or something. Well, that doesn't mean Four Roses isn't good. There's plenty of people out there who really love Four Roses and they like that particular thing. That's just not your preference, and that's different.
Exactly.
And there's cheap bourbon, right? And I tell people, there's a category called cheap bourbon, and some of it's actually not that bad. But it's, what do you want for $12? You can't expect a $100 experience for $12. Right. But then you move into the category I call your everyday drinking bourbons, and there's just quite a few in that category that are reasonably priced, readily available, and so on. And then you start getting into the higher end products, and then eventually you get into the overhyped, overpriced. Why are you chasing down that and spending that kind of money for it? It's good stuff, but it's not worth that. And so that's kind of how I categorize things. And I said, look, I don't think we've put anything on the table that's just awful, but we put things on the table that people, for whatever reason, it's not their flavor preference. Like I said, the cafe au lait, you don't enjoy coffee, then maybe you're not going to enjoy that.
Look, I was tasting with a couple. The wife, I think, was more into whiskey than the husband was, but neither of them were big whiskey drinkers. In general, it was more, I think, for their son, who in turn was more of a Scotch drinker. So it was an interesting experience.
Yeah.
but yeah, you could tell through taste of the OCD, definitely the cafe au lait, the sweet. I don't think we got to the cob, but we got the Millville malt as well. You could see the wheels turning their heads as they tasted these things. It was really fun to see that in people while you're tasting. I know we're running short on time, but I want to close out on just one or two more things quickly.
Okay, no problem.
The first one being that Millville malt. So I'll be up front, and you'll see this in the reviews when they go live. My favorite overall of everything that I got to taste was, in fact, the cafe au lait.
Okay.
It narrowly beat out the OCD premium for me, just a little bit, but it beat it out by nature of its uniqueness.
Mm-hmm.
And I loved it. And I got to try the Corvetto Vivo again. Like, I like that as well. The sweet, I felt, was it was just like a caramel bomb.
Mm-hmm.
Like just Werther's and caramel taffy and vanilla taffy all over the place.
Yeah, I hear that a lot with that one, actually.
Yeah. But the Millville malt, I was really interested in, because I'm on a kick with American single malts right now, writing a few things, and by the time this episode goes live, the standards of identity might have been made formal, but as of recording, they're still in the proposal stage. So from what you've said and what I've heard, there's only going to be these 3 barrels that are there.
Right.
And I have to say, after tasting them, that makes me sad, because
well, we still have some, Dave. You can certainly buy some, stock up.
It was part of the order that I put in, so that's
so. So, I'll just explain that, because I talked about it a little bit earlier, how some things don't work in our process, and it starts at the stills. One of the things we do that's unusual is we have direct heat on the stills. So there's a flame on the still, and it's like cooking food on your stove. If you put a pot of food on the stove and turn the heat on, it's going to burn if you don't stir it. Our stills don't have agitators. So we have to extract the liquid. We separate the liquid from the grain prior to distillation. And the trouble is the small grains, and that's 100% malt. So that's one of the small grains. They're more finely ground. We have to use cracked corn as well to make it go through that machine. As a screw press, it squeezes it and gets the liquid out. So the Corvetto, for example, with the higher percentage of small grains, just goes through that machine so slow. It's just slow. When we do cob, I put in perspective. When we do cob, okay, if I start that at 9 o'clock in the morning on the screw press, I can have 2 totes of cob through the press by noon, because it's all cracked corn and it doesn't have any small grains. If I do 2 Corvettos, I'm lucky to get through the second one by 7 o'clock at night.
Wow.
So I'm currently working on a new piece of equipment that the manufacturer seems to think will help expedite that with those smaller grains. In which case, then we could go back and make malt whiskey again. It was so much trouble to get the liquid separated from the grain that we just kind of looked at each other and said, "Nah, it's not worth the trouble." So it might happen. Don't count it out yet. We just right now is to look at our current process. It's just really a pain in the neck. Just really.
Look, makes sense, and with the capacity you've got, that's a consideration. So
or we do, again, back to what you said earlier, invest in a lauter tun that they use in Scotland for that step, because they're separating out the grain before fermentation. And there's ways to do it. And I'm really working on that other piece of equipment that I think will help us increase our capacity overall, because that machine is the bottleneck step of our process right now, and it's kind of what's holding us. We've got enough distillation capacity and fermentation capacity and cooking capacity. We just can't get it through that machine. So anyway, I'm glad you liked it, and I think I'm not a heavy peat guy. And so, we controlled the level of peat at a kind of a lower level, but that one is 100% malted, and we triple distill it. And, we tried to replicate Scottish procedure as much as possible on that one.
Yeah. The peat, the smoke, it's very mild. It's very approachable.
Yeah.
I don't mind a good bit of peat in some of the stuff that I like, and it was quite delicious. And the other question I had just on that particular product was, as we said, there are any number of reasons why it could have tasted differently than another American single malt that I've tried or that. But do you know the strain of barley that was being used for that?
So the base malt was a Pilsner barley, and this peat smoked we imported from Scotland. And as I recall, the peat, so on the peat, they measure the phenols in a parts per million level. And so preferring a lighter smokiness, I went with a 20 ppm. Got it from the malt come from Brewers Supply Group, which is imported from Scotland.
That makes so much sense in terms of what I was tasting, because I was thinking this tastes like it was distilled from a beer that you could actually drink.
Yeah, that was a result of one of the many experiments that I had done, because I was getting malt from the liquor store in their brewing section, and then I finally made a relationship with the local brewery who had access to bags of different malts, Munich malts, IPA malts, or Pilsner malts, and so forth. And so I experimented with a lot of different malts to see what effect they had on the flavor as well. And so that was why I chose a Pilsner base, because I had done an experiment and kind of enjoyed the result.
It makes so much sense, and this is why I like having these conversations, because that was the piece of the puzzle I was missing.
Yeah.
And perfect. So with that, Dave, I'll let you go in a minute. We're just going to close out with a couple of things. So number one, again, I can't stress this enough to the listeners. I spent a week in Kentucky and Tennessee, and I'm pretty sure my experience in tasting stuff at Glens Creek was the highlight, of not top 2 or 3. It was just an excellent experience, whether it's Dave leading you through, whether it's John leading you through. I had John personally when I was there. It's just a really great experience. Make it a day, go there, go to Castle and Key next door, go visit the area. And I can't recommend it enough. So, and for that matter, I know you guys are distributed only in Kentucky and locally for the moment. I've got an order in. A friend's going to help me get that legally, of course. But definitely go in and try. And if you like something, buy it, because it might not be there the next time you come. So,
yeah. And I believe you got some things through what's known as the Glens Creek Vault, where on our website you can purchase things and we can hold them for you. We can't ship. It's your state's laws that restrict the shipping, not us.
Yep.
But it will hold it for you. And if a friend comes to get it, or if you make your way here, it'll be there for you. And certain things, like you mentioned, the OCD premium, we get about 2 barrels of that a year. The big challenge for us in terms of distribution is just having the supply. And honestly, with the demand we have right here, we increased production a few years back, but the nature of this business is you can increase production, but you don't feel the effects for several years.
Right.
And so I think rolling into 2023, we're going to be in a better position to have the aged product ready and can explore further distribution at that point. But it's just been a supply issue is really what's restricted it. We get most of the visitors here, and yeah, I have to say, John does a great job on those tastings too. He's been here with me from almost day one, and you've got no matter who you sit with, if you sit with one of the other folks, you got sometimes some summer help or whatever, but everybody here learns to do all the work. Everybody here can explain the work. They can explain the process. Vicki out front does some short tastings, and she's immersed herself and learned about the place and the process, the history, and all those things. And so, you're not going to get a spiel. You're not going to get the same experience that you've gotten in the other places. People are going to be able to answer your questions if you have technical questions and you want to know about it. So that's one thing that I think sets us apart, is no matter who you talk to, there's somebody who knows about the process. And if they don't know about the process, they'll find somebody who does and can answer those questions.
Can I ask more than that? Trust me, really can't. So again, thank you so much, Dave, for coming on, for providing those samples, which again led me to buy a bunch of products from the vault and from the regular lineup. Go visit them on McCracken Pike down in Frankfurt. I'll put links to all the social media, the website, and such in the show notes for this episode. Make sure to click through and look at all the information on the website. In the meantime, follow this podcast on any of your podcast platform, rate and reviews, subscribe so you don't miss an episode. Dave, hold on with me just for a second after we finish up.
No problem.
And, it's been another episode of Whiskey Ring Podcast. See you next week.
Thanks for having me, David.